audience to this event for the London Festival of Architecture. Who cares about the in-between? Last time we were here, it was a building site when we hosted an LFA event, so it's very nice to be back in the space that we designed as a finished building. Just a quick thank you to all of the Paddington Works and Threefold team and all their efforts in putting this event on. And the team is peppered around the space, so if you need anything from us, just grab us in a socially distanced fashion and we'll do what we can to help. And before I start proceedings, I'd just like to introduce our chair for this evening, Laura Mark. Laura is an award-winning architecture critic, a designer and curator based in London. She's the keeper of Warmer Yard and also runs the Baylight Foundation, where she curates a number of programs and projects that explore how we experience architecture. Laura also teaches at the Bartlett School of Architecture, the University of Greenwich, and she is currently undertaking a PhD which surveys the cultural history of the senses in architecture. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Laura, who'll see us through tonight's proceedings. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Jack. So the title of tonight's talk, Who Cares About the In-Between, is particularly poignant at this time as we try to navigate through an in-between moment. We're hosting this event in an almost kind of in-between where online and in-person kind of meet. While things are beginning to go back a little to normal, we must ensure we don't forget the kind of lessons we've learned of the pandemic, that we taught us about how we live and care for everyone in our society. So thinking about the title of Who Cares About the In-Between, I was kind of led to the Japanese architect Sue Fujimoto. He commented on it as being not only between nature and architecture, but also between inside and outside, adding every kind of definition has an in-between space, especially if the definitions are two opposites. The in-between space is more rich. So this is a very Japanese way of thinking. The Japanese even have a word for the in-between. It's called ma. And I kind of bring this up as I think it's a really relevant starting point for this talk. So for the architects here in the room, the in-between will often be thought of as a space between buildings, or the non-programmed or unassignable spaces within your plans. But it's also a place where boundaries are blurred and crossovers happen. The in-between isn't just about these things. Like the title of Young Girl's seminal book, it's also about the life between buildings. Today, we'll hear not just from the architects, but also from developers, landscape architects, and engagement experts in order to widen our understanding of the in-between and to highlight the key influences which it might have on our future. So tonight, we're joined by a great host of speakers. We've got Renée Searle, who's founding director of Threefold. Renée was the director in charge of Threefold's new Addington and Fieldway master plan for Brick by Brick, and is currently the lead architect on a mixed-use scheme of 10,000 square feet of workspace and 70 homes in Haringey. Next up, we'll have Tina John, who's Pockets Living's new creative and architectural design manager. She joined Pocket Living earlier this year and oversees the design of all their projects. And then we've got Sarah Douglas. Sarah is the founder of Liminal Space, which is a creative agency that works across disciplines to create experiences which transform what people feel and do. They are currently working on an installation in collaboration with UCL and the Museum of the Home. Then we've got Nick Searl, who is the managing partner of Argent. Nick headed up Argent's 10-year transformation of King's Cross and is now part of the leadership team working on Brent Cross. Shawn Adams is the co-founder of Poor Collective, a social enterprise that focuses on the development of communities through the elevation of young people. And then we have Jacob Willson. Jacob is the head of design at BeFirst, Barking and Dagenham Council's development arm. He's currently leading on several research areas, including modern methods of construction and sustainable design. And then last but not least, we're joined by landscape architect Sophie Thompson. Sophie is a director at LDA Design, where she delivers livable streets, squares and parks. She's currently leading the design of the £35 million West End project. So each of our speakers will now give a short presentation, and then we'll open up for discussion. If you're joining us online, then please do add your thoughts and questions in the chat. Jan here, my trusty kind of sidekick, will be excellently navigating between our online audience and our panel in the room, and we'll make sure your comments are all put forward. So also, if you're here in the room, store up your questions because we'll be coming to you. So let's start with Renée.
Hello, thank you, Laura. At Threefold, we believe and we make buildings that do more for us. In our minds, the in-between is an opportunity to realise more. How to be more productive, more healthy, more collaborative, and more inspired. We've selected a handful of projects this evening which we've been working on, both in-house research projects and live schemes for progressive clients. This is a physical intervention where we pitched, designed and delivered a physical intervention to unite 4 previously disparate companies under one roof. A 72-metre long CLT bridge inserted at a half level in between 2 floors within a warehouse in Dartford, designed as a primary circulation route, but also offering spaces to stop, work independently, congregate and collaborate. Since its delivery, it's informed our approach for many of our workspace schemes for clients such as the Crown Estate, exploring the future of workspace, and Airbnb, with who we've pioneered concepts such as flexible and agile working, wellness at work, corporate responsibility. We've crafted spaces that embody the culture of an organisation, attract talent, and encourage productivity. Through these projects, we've grown to understand that the office is more than a place to work. It's a destination, a place for shared experience, for fostering creativity and collaboration, for skills and mentoring, health and well-being. Tonight, we're in a threefold project, a space that has a keen focus on promoting wellness and well-being at the workplace. Paddington Works has invested in technologies which improve air quality, integrate circadian rhythm lighting, provide ergonomic seating, and a variety of spaces which encourage agile working. For us, healthy means both physical and mental well-being, but it also means healthy to and for the environment. As architects, it's our responsibility to help facilitate positive change in a way that our built environment impacts our planet. A building's performance depends on an agenda being driven by a client and design team, which places sustainability at the forefront of a holistic strategy, not bolted on at the end. This is a drawing, Forest to Facade, which was awarded the Royal Academy Architectural Prize for Sustainability in 2019. In its simplest sense, the drawing is a survey of a non-native pine woodland in the South Downs National Park. It's a survey, but also a material schedule, which calculates the quantity of timber available from the woodland to use as cladding for the new building, bringing the timber straight from the forest to the facade. This working drawing demonstrates our commitment to driving an agenda about sourcing local materials and skills. We were lucky to have a site with an abundance of usable material, but we also had a client who is committed to investing more time, effort, and resource between the inception and completion of a project, into thinking about the life cycle of the project, ensuring a more healthy building which sits lightly on the earth. Over the last 3 years, we've been working with Brick by Brick, who've pioneered an initiative for council-owned property developers, delivering homes on council-owned land and returning the proceeds from the development to the council instead of a private shareholder. Working with Brick by Brick and collaborating with their architectural cohort was a great opportunity for us to work with a client that was trying to do things differently. A strong focus on a social and environmental responsibility, whilst aspiring to achieve the highest standards of design. The Small Sites programme commissioned talented architects to design homes on sites that other developers would not touch. These in-between sites presented a multitude of challenges, from access to overlooking to utilities to refuse, and of course viability. Each of our schemes called for a highly specific site response, form and architectural expression. Our 12 buildings filled gaps, book-ended terraces, crowned corners, created muses, and stitched cul-de-sacs. Each scheme working hard to do more, embedding themselves into their context whilst respecting their neighbours, seeking to enhance their communities and improve neighbourhoods, offering spaces to play and high-quality landscape, using materials healthy to reduce the impact on the environment. For us, inspiring can come from beautifully crafted spaces, but also from briefs which challenge use, mix, and programme. Our recent long listing for the Davidson Prize is a response to our sudden and dramatic shift in living and working over the last 18 months. Our proposal seeks to rebalance the net to gross for future housing developments, to make the spaces in between work harder. By re-envisioning the Housing Design Guide standards, we sought to create sensorially stimulating spaces from which to work from home, which lie between the net internal area of a dwelling and the gross internal area of a development. Our Swaker Yard project in Boreham Wood has allowed us to bring to fruition some of these ideas. The new development is a 50-50 split of workspace and homes in a traditionally residential-led commuter town. The commercial element will be part flexible office, part co-working hub, with free spaces available to residents, enabling them to work near home. We've recently acquired planning permission for 149 new affordable homes in Harrow for pocket living, who have an innovative housing model, offering affordable homes for first-time buyers at below market rates, home for the in-between dweller. As a company, Pocket are quick to evolve, already thinking about how their model could be adapted to follow shifts in living and working patterns. We've been working with them to define a brief for shared amenity spaces within their developments, creating spaces adjoining the home between the net and the gross for residents to come together. Spaces for wellness, for working, or to socialise. It's in these spaces where programmes overlap and people cross over, where opportunities for innovation and inspiration can occur. The last year has forced into focus issues of importance, acutely noted by this year's LFA theme, Care. The in-between offers an opportunity for those commissioning, designing, and delivering the built environment to create a more interesting, more integrated, inclusive, engaging, and more considerate spaces for us to live, work, and play. There's a responsibility to demonstrate the value associated with these other or in-between spaces and how they're integral to making us more healthy, more inspired, more productive, and more collaborative. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that, Renée. I don't think I need to say anything more at all. You've already introduced everything that we had to say about Pocket. Right. So when a developer like Pocket starts to think about what the in-between space is all about, we're talking about the forgotten middle. So what is this forgotten middle, and what does it actually mean to us? We're talking about the people. Who are these people that we're talking about? It's the people that are actually being priced out of London. It's the people who are the city makers, the ones who are actually running London, the people who can't actually afford to get onto the property ladder unless you're maybe in your mid-30s. And it's that sort of people that we're catering to, the forgotten middle, the ones that, haven't been given the opportunity to get onto a property ladder and make this city their home. We provide affordable, well-designed homes to these city makers so that they can call London their place. But at the same time, it's also about those forgotten sites, the small sites, the ones that other developers might not usually look at. And the reason why they might not look at is because it's constrained, it might not give you the same sort of viability, it might not have the same sort of developmental potential when they look at it. So we as Pocket look at these sites that may be like a garage or a car park, or sites that are, definitely have multiple constraints. Over the last 13 odd years, what we've done is work with a great number of fantastic architects to innovate, and teams of planners to come up with out-of-the-box thinking and ideas to produce these sort of wonderful buildings on those constrained sites. We work with over 70% of the boroughs in London, work with them really closely to provide the much needed affordable housing that we require, and at the correct price point for the people that are being marginalised. So how is it that we can actually try and achieve this? And it all eventually comes down to good practice in design, a really robust brief, and great placemaking. This particular example is one of our sites in Haringey called West Green Place, which actually just today got shortlisted for a placemaking award. And this site was originally a underused community centre and a car park that was quite redundant. And effectively, working with HTA, what we've done is managed to take up that space and create a tree-lined avenue of about 98 pocket homes and 16 townhouses with a beautiful entrance square that faces, fronts the park and has a community hall along with a creche, and it's really helping the local neighbourhood to integrate into a site that would have been forgotten. The next project I'm going to share with you is one that we did with McCrainer Lavington in Southwark. And as opposed to the project that we looked at before, this one in particular was a really tight site. It was an MOT garage and didn't have the potential to have that sort of a landscaped element. So what the architects came up with for on this particular plot was a really compact mansion block, but looking inwards, what they tried to create was lots of communal spaces and step terraces to be able to provide that sort of amenity to the residents. So being able to work on these tight sites means you need to come up with really innovative ideas of how these compact sites could be filled with compact homes. And this particular project, you may recognize, recently won the RIBA Sterling Prize by Metropolitan Workshop, was built on a really, really tight triangular site with a river on one side and an urban block on the other. It's just 0.5 hectares, and we managed to get about 98 units on there, over 27 stories. And to be able to build on this sort of a constrained plot, the best way of doing it was to go modular. And until recently, this was the tallest modular building at 27 stories in all of Europe. So how does the pocket unit actually work? So what we've come up with is a really well-designed one-bed, one-person unit that actually just makes use of clever principles to create a space that is usable but not wasteful. So you have a generous living room, bedroom, and kitchen area alongside good storage space. That gives you, a beautiful living experience without being overtly expensive. Just well-designed elements, really large windows, and Juliet balconies that open up and have that connectivity with the outside. At the end of the day, no scheme is going to be successful if you're not creating thriving neighborhoods and building those sort of communities that you're really looking for. So one of the main elements of our design is to be able to provide those in-between spaces within our developments, shared spaces that people can actually use, providing roof terraces, providing communal rooms like libraries or work-from-home booths. And that, in the last year, has really made a big difference in the lives of our residents. We always encourage building strong communities right from the onset. The minute our flats are sold, we host residents' drinks where everybody's brought together, introduced to each other, so they start, interacting with each other. And most of our residents will attest that in the last year, having these sort of communal spaces where they can feel comfortable, be able to go without feeling inhibited and interact with their neighbours, while the rest of us at home weren't given the liberty to do that, has made a big difference on their lifestyle and their well-being. So I'm just going to conclude by saying what sets us apart and makes, Pocket different is the fact that we care not only about the environment, but about the people who live in our homes and being able to provide them with good quality homes at an affordable price. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Douglas. Great to be with you guys today in person. I feel like it's the first time my team aren't able to mute me. So, yeah, great to be here. So, thanks so much. Let's hope this PowerPoint's going to work for me. So, I've always been really fascinated by in-between spaces, people. What happens in the in-between, I think, is really, really powerful, between cultures, between languages, and it's really what drew me to the concept of liminal, which is a word that describes an in-between state. So a liminal state is a place of transition. It's a place between the kind of past and the forthcoming future. And it's also a state that's really in flux and kind of full of possibility. So it's what inspired me to set up the company that I run, which is called the Liminal Space. And we are a purpose-led design studio that creates groundbreaking experiences that change how people think, feel, and do. We are socially motivated and work with a range of brands, organisations, universities, and whether it's with Wellcome Trust, Selfridges, or the NHS, what we do is we create tangible experiences and ways to engage the public with difficult social topics. So I'm going to talk through a few examples of our projects, but particularly with an emphasis on 3 different kinds of in-between that I'm particularly fascinated by. So firstly, in-between disciplines. So that's really thinking about how you bring different skill sets, mindsets, and approaches together to tackle large social challenges and to create incredibly new ways of doing things. In between systems, so then really thinking about particularly the people that fall between dominant systems and what you can do, how you can redesign systems to make sure that doesn't happen. The third kind of in-between I'm really passionate about is actually finding whole systems and trying to find ways to break them up. So that's something that when I was doing this talk, I realised actually a lot of the work that we do is about trying to prise apart existing structures to create in-betweens where they don't exist already. So firstly on disciplines, in-between disciplines, why is that of interest to us? Well, I think we can probably all agree that we face some pretty massive social challenges and that really bringing very different ways of seeing things, particularly around different kinds of lived experience, together with different expertise is a really important and exciting way to meet those challenges. One example of how we're doing that and how we do in all of our projects is we work with really cross-sector organisations and people. And in this particular project called Tomorrow's Home, we're bringing data scientists, ethicists, communities, clinicians, engineers together to think about the home of tomorrow and to make it a more human-centred experience. And why it's so important to do this is that one of the things we find is that the public is really shut out of these conversations often, and that we know that, for example, things like healthcare is going to hugely change how we interact with our homes. Smart devices are going to mean that our data and our home becomes potentially a site of surveillance, but also will enable an ageing population to live really independently for much longer. But often the public aren't engaged with these conversations until that is a kind of present reality. So the work that we do is really around how can you create environments where they can explore some of these topics in a way that they can also feed in and participate in what are some of the coming changes that we are all going to have to encounter and grapple with. So this installation is going to be on at the Museum of the Home in autumn. It's in partnership with UCL, with the Royal Academy of Engineering, and with the Museum of the Home, and really kind of looking at kind of cross-sector, multidisciplinary approaches to helping the public engage and think about the future of the home and how we all want to live. So now on to in-between systems. What happens in between systems? Well, between work, home, culture, economics, we all interact with these huge interconnected systems all the time. They are the systems that make up the fabric of our society. But there are many, many, many gaps, and I think the last 18 months has really shown that too, that there are many gaps in between systems, but also within the systems themselves. And that's something that I'm personally particularly passionate about, is how do you work with the gaps between systems and also the people that fall through those gaps. So I'll give you an example. Fred here with his arms folded is somebody who falls through these gaps. So he's a long-term night shift worker, and he is more likely than any other worker within the population to develop a whole host of health issues, from mental health issues to cancer, diabetes, heart disease. But the way that our employment system is structured means that he's also one of the least likely employed people to get any health and well-being support at work. So we've looked at night shift workers a lot and worked with people like Fred, and we designed an intervention called the Night Club, which is backed by Wellcome Trust and a whole host of other industry partners. And what Night Club is it's a travelling health intervention that goes to direct to workplaces and is open at night. It's staffed by sleep scientists who work with night shift workers who are in the very lowest paid night shift work, to help them change their sleep habits and give them some information that mitigates some of these damaging health effects, but also works really closely with the leadership teams to try and affect practice change at what is quite a difficult end and very low margin end of the workforce. So this is an example of an intervention in very quite desolate in between spaces. So we've spent much of the last 2 years travelling around Amazon warehouses and warehouses around the country delivering this project. So that's an example of in between systems. And then how about activating these, creating in between spaces where they don't exist already? We think in-between spaces are so powerful that we do like to prize things apart to try and create interventions. We've done this in all sorts of spaces. We've worked in shopping centres, train stations, setting up pop-up interventions that challenge people to think differently about some of the biggest social topics of our age in between spaces when they're not expecting it. This is an example of a project that you can see at the moment at the Natural History Museum, where we've worked with the team there on their Anthropocene exhibition. And the challenge here that we were set was, how do you get a younger audience to engage with thinking about climate change in what is an incredibly overwhelming topic for all of us to get our heads around. But how can you work with the kind of vernacular culture and get young people to engage with it? So we've created interventions around their exhibition. For example, little questions, provocative questions, artifacts of our own that sneak into the Natural History Museum space and create an alternative journey for viewers and audiences around the space and around the content. We've inserted personalised burger wrappers around skulls, and they're easily missed, but also that's part of the power of them, is that we're creating a very personal journey around a very traditional and established space, prizing apart and intervening. So in summary, interventions in the in-between bring us into this liminal space, a space of open-ended inquiry and transformation. Given the very knotty social topics and issues that we face, I believe we all need to spend more time in this liminal space, where new ideas and collaborations are formed, and where new ways of doing things definitely are possible. Thank you.
Am I going to press the right button? No, I'm going to press it. There we are. As you say, it's really nice to be in front of real faces, and nobody can turn their screen off or video off, so that's quite nice. Who cares about the in-between? Well, I certainly do. What I thought I'd just do today is actually go back 27 years in my career I've been lucky enough to work on 4 major mixed-use schemes over those 27 years. And some of them have been more successful than others. That was the first one. This was in Bangkok. That what you're seeing there is public space that's actually up on the 6th floor. It has no relationship to any other part of the city. It's overlooked by some rather disastrous apartments, and that was I thought that was good. That's what I thought good looked like in 1994. And it wasn't until I came back here and started to learn a few different things that my mind started to change. And the next thing I got to work on was exactly where we are now. I spent about 6 years of my life working on Paddington Basin. And Paddington Basin, I just went for a little walk around it before I came in here, and all these wonderful in-between spaces around the canal now are actually quite well activated. But in the days when we were talking about this, back in the early noughties, actually the argument was this was all about the heritage, the industrial heritage of the canals, and there was an argument against ground floor uses in the bottom of the buildings, which is why now when you want to go and have a drink, it's all temporary stuff that's dotted around the place because it wasn't designed for it. And it was kind of crazy. And actually, Paddington Basin has now become much more mature. It's starting to work. And actually, those temporary uses around the space actually are fine. But what more could it have been? I also got to work with Thomas Heatherwick when he was a small boy. So that was quite interesting. And then I went to King's Cross in 2007. And the interesting thing about King's Cross and it was the mindset. It was the mindset that started by saying this actually, the space that we're creating here is for everybody. Not just the space itself, but the relationship between public spaces and ground floors of buildings are places for everybody. And while we are master planners, in inverted commas, we are the people who are creating this, we're actually not the ones who are going to create this. The people who come here are going to create this. So the mindset was, how do you make this incredibly welcoming, incredibly inclusive for anybody and everybody who wants to be here? That was the mindset. And for me, that was utterly liberating because everything I'd worked on before had come from a different perspective. There was also something about those spaces that was the strength of vision, the power in the vision, and the people who I wasn't there when this was drawn, but the power of that vision and having then really baked that into a team psyche to actually drive it through. So that the thinking about in-between space for us was all about how do you create the settings for these wonderful buildings as well, because there was so much great stuff that we had to work with, but actually they were already there, they were sitting there, nobody could go anywhere near them. So we had to create the settings for those to occur. And we had to create variety. A huge amount of variety went into that. When you've got this much scope, you've got to think about how you, again, that inclusivity is all about creating different opportunities for different people. And this is, I mean, these images display a couple of different things. One is my point around people. The energy of any of these places only actually becomes apparent when people arrive. But the reason I put these two in here is because these are really awkward spaces. And actually, it's the most awkward spaces that end up often being the most successful because you get an intensity that comes from them. Lower Stable Street here, we must have agonised over that for 10 years and never thought it could ever work and nobody would ever go down there. And it was actually Thomas who actually helped us to unlock how we would get people down there. And even then, it actually took quite a while. But actually, it's ending up being part of the most successful. You know, these places were designed for coal and horses. They weren't designed for people and shops. But actually, it's their unusual nature and their limited space that actually creates the intensity and the energy that we all love about them. And then what do you do with all these spaces? I mean, I'll just flick through these things, but it is so critical to us, and in terms of how we think about the in-between, is that we do something with it. It is not there to be a static event. So for us, the events and activation, but actually for me, it's the temporary that is so interesting. The temporary is so interesting because at the moment you take it away, That's what's so interesting, is when you take something away and then firstly you get a load of people complain, and secondly you have to really then challenge yourself as to how you're going to do that again but better. And it's constantly signposting the future. So I think, you know, temporary installation and activation, and this is about inclusivity, just making sure that, you know, if you design, I think, you know, this is a bit of a cliche, but if you design a place that kids will love, everybody else will love it too. And this is becoming more and more important, actually. We have found that more people have come back to King's Cross quicker than many other parts of London. And it's been because of these in-between spaces and because of the programming that goes on in those spaces that people have come. There was a period during lockdown where we actually had to close areas off because people were still coming to congregate there. They got used to just coming and being there. So King's Cross for me was a huge liberating experience. I wasn't the genius who came up with all the stuff at the beginning. I was lucky to be there and to be part of this. If you're in our industry, and you can't enjoy doing what we've been allowed to do there in central London, then you shouldn't be in our industry, because it's been an extraordinary experience. This is what we're doing next, and this has become even more fascinating in the last 18 months. It hasn't particularly changed what we were doing, but it has made a lot of it very much more relevant. I think you all know where Brent Cross is, so the fascinating thing about it is on this edge of the city kind of scenario that we're talking about here, and it's, I mean, just that just gives you a sense of the scale of it. It's 3 times the land area of King's Cross. It's not as dense. It's about between 10 and 12 million square feet. We'll see what happens as we get out. But the really, really exciting thing about it is that, and that was exciting for me even before the pandemic came and all the issues that we're now dealing with, because that green space is part of the master plan area. It is currently metropolitan open land, but it has a planning permission for sport play. So we're getting to be able to incorporate that into that major development, and we're thinking very carefully about how does countryside and town come together. This is, you know, what we're all thinking about. How do these things come together? How do we create a green framework that actually becomes the setting for all of the buildings in different ways? How does that green space reach in? How do we think about the different neighbourhoods in different ways as settings for different kinds of buildings as we go through it? And then this is just the first phase of buildings, and to me this is the diagram that I enjoy most. This is the heat map. This is the human experience of moving around between those buildings. And we use this to kind of guide how we think people will experience the space. And I've put this one in just because this is a park that we've already built. This is in between, it's a temporary space, it's in between the past and the future. It's pointing to the future. It's created opportunities that these kids just did not have in this area at all very, very quickly. And that's made a huge difference. And this is the first permanent park that will come along straight after that. So that's my experience of 27 years of major mixed-use schemes. Thank you.
Well, hi everyone. You're going to soon see that I smile as much as you see in the photograph. I think it's definitely great to see everyone. I mean, seeing everyone over Zoom on a square box has been very infuriating. So it's great to see all of you today. So a little bit about Paul Collective before I kind of go into the in-between space is Paul Collective essentially is a social enterprise that works with young people and aims to elevate young people in the community, so to give them a platform. And I think when we think about in-between spaces, what we really think about is how these spaces can give people a voice. And I think that is something that's really kind of profound and really meaningful for us, because I think a lot of the time when we speak of in-between spaces, they are transitory spaces where people on the periphery are often passing through, are pushed into. And I think these are the kind of themes that are really pertinent and powerful for us in Paul Collective. So the first image that I'm showing you is in fact a mural, and I think some of the examples have been fantastic, but I'm going to take it down in scale a little bit. And I think when we speak about in-between spaces, we speak about the spaces that really have value to people. So for us, before we had made this mural, it was literally just a kind of quite gloomy wall that was unused. But why can't we kind of see this as an in-between space? Is because now it's something that kind of brightens up the road, but it's much more than that. In the actual mural, we worked with a local boxing gym. So each of the kind of black elements represent the local community. So the red part is the Doddington estate, which is the estate where the majority of the people that are around that space use. There's a kind of pizza. There's a guitar that represents the kind of music studio. The boxing gloves are actually a memorial to two of the young people that sadly passed away in the area. But what's important here is that it is something that is of value to the local community. So it's something where they kind of come to, they take pictures, they engage with people. It's a landmark. And I think that is something that we think is incredibly important when we're talking about in between. The next image is of exhibition that is actually on at the moment. So it's also part of the LFA's kind of program for the year. And this is an exhibition for the People's Pavilion competition, which is a competition for young people between the ages 14 to 19. But what is interesting here is that this is actually at Here East's campus. But as you can kind of see, it's in what I would call an underpath that is quite unused. Cyclists quickly navigate quite rapidly through it. But what we wanted to do here was have an exhibition that celebrated the designs of young people. So again, giving the young people a stake in their environment and giving them a reason to bring people to the space. Because I think when we're talking about in between, we often think about spaces that we kind of want to rush away from. We don't want to be in those spaces. We don't want to kind of engage in those spaces, but we see value in those spaces. Those spaces that we think that, oh, you know what, no one wants to be here, the dark alleyways, the kind of underpass or bridges, they're spaces of opportunity. And I think this project by Yinka Ilori perfectly illustrates that. I mean, this is actually a commission that the LFA actually did. So this is in Wandsworth, close to 9 Elms. And as you can imagine, underpaths for bridges are quite morbid. They're horrible. Everyone wants to kind of rush through them. You don't really want to stay there. But what is powerful here is that he's designed something that's quite vibrant. And as you kind of see the young people there, it's no longer a space where you kind of think, I want to move past and I don't want to be there. It's a place that is celebrated. And I think there's a lot of power in seeing the opportunity within these spaces, and I think it does really help to unlock some of the kind of architecture and design of our kind of forgotten or unrealized spaces. I mean, I'm not quite a skater. I don't know how many of you skated in your heydays or continue to skate, but I'm sure everyone knows South Bank. Underneath there, if there weren't skaters, you would be thinking this is quite a horrible space to be at, but it's interesting that whilst there's not much there, there's such a bustling community there. And I think that's something that when we speak about the in-between, you can't just look at a space and think it's of no value. And I think there's really a lot of value in these spaces that you look at and you just think they're horrible because you could remove this. And I know there's been endless kind of battles of trying to move out the skaters, but how do you recreate this experience? How do you recreate this sense of gathering and this sense of opportunity? And I think when we think of the in-between, I think that's definitely one of the things that we need to think about. The next image is a project by 2 Central St. Martin students in Croydon. I don't know how many of you are South Londoners. I know Croydon might be quite far away for a lot of you. I'm not too sure what happened there. But what is really interesting about... What is interesting about this project is that it's literally a series of objects. And I think if you think about the in-between, how can a series of objects activate a space? You see people kind of sitting there. There's opportunities for the local community to come together, for people to speak, make new kind of interactions, make new relationships with people. And I think when we think about the in-between, we really need to think about how do we create these interactions? How do we provide a space that allows for this. And sometimes as designers, as architects, we kind of assume that we're doing that, but sometimes it's by creating the most simple things you create these opportunities. And I think that's something that's quite profound about it, because when I've been past here, when this wasn't there weren't people sitting around. I mean, I would imagine that like now there probably isn't many people sitting around, but you kind of get the gist that by simply putting things and providing opportunities, an in-between space becomes a space that's animated and really powerful. I put this kind of next example. I mean, I don't actually really like this kind of snake-like form, but I think what's really powerful about it is that if you think about it, it's in a way is an alleyway. It's wide enough for you to kind of say it's not somewhere that you would like think is as bad as a really narrow alleyway. However, by simply putting this worm-like green form, you've activated the space. You've given opportunity for kids to kind of play on there. You've given opportunity for people to sit, people to read. And I think if you were to move this, I think people are just kind of, it really is an in-between space in the sense of you go from one place to another and you don't dwell. Because I think that's something that when we talk about in-between space, we really got to think about dwelling. What does it mean to dwell? What does it mean to be in that space? Why are you in that space? The next example is for many of you, I'm sure you've kind of been to Shoreditch and seen a lot of the plots in Shoreditch that are kind of waiting for a development to arise. And I think what is quite interesting about Shoreditch is there are loads of these kind of weird and odd spaces. So like Dinorama, Last Days of Shoreditch, where there's kind of like this scaffolding. And I mean, in terms of architecture, I'm sure a lot of the architects are thinking, I absolutely hate this. These structures and shipping containers, I hate them. However, what I think is quite powerful about these spaces is that, again, look how bustling it is. It's a transitory space. It's a space that's not going to be there for a long time. But look how much energy and vibrancy it has. And I think when you think about that, how do we as designers recreate that? And I think that's such a kind of powerful and profound thing to think about, because when a development comes, do we really think there will be as many people as there are now at that development? A few more images. I think this one is really not really an in-between space, but what is interesting about it is how the space is used, because I think a lot of the time we assume a space is going to be used in a certain way. However, the reality is completely different. So these are some of the roofs in Tehran in Iran. And as you can kind of see, there's several different activities happening. People are having dinner. I should have put the pictures of people playing instruments on the roof. People putting mats on the roof as well, and prayer happening. And I think this is quite interesting in the sense that sometimes we design spaces, but the way they're used are completely different. They're completely different from how we kind of intended them to be used. And I think, again, that unlocks endless amounts of opportunity. Here is a kind of a comparison of like these kind of spaces that I would imagine most of us would think lack opportunity in Romania, but by simply adding some color and vibrancy, you're kind of seeing that now they are much more kind of engaging than they were before. And I mean, I understand that they're super low tech. They're not a big budget here, but they already kind of allow you to understand the space in a completely different way. As you can kind of see by the far right, those orange blocks at the end, you can imagine people are sitting there now, and it becomes a landmark. The in-between space becomes a landmark. If you were to say to your friend, we're going to go like meet up by the orange part of the alleyway, now there's a kind of space that you can identify and go to. And then finally, I think a between space that I think is quite close to our heart is a space in Agbogbloshie, so in Ghana. And I think this is often when we think of in-between spaces, we don't think about what happens as a response to kind of pushing people out of a space and removing them from where their in-between space is. And I think this is a kind of fantastic example of an in-between space that might appear very morbid and quite horrible, but there's kind of endless amounts of opportunity here, because essentially what you're seeing here is an electronic waste site where all of our kind of old electronics go. So out of that, a kind of in-between space where young African males from Ghana have come together and created a whole society. And I think what is incredibly powerful about this is that whilst again it looks horrible, there's so many lessons that we can learn here from how they interact with each other, how they've created a new kind of way of living, a whole kind of society around a space that is very horrible and very precarious. And I think again, when I say about in between spaces, and whilst they may look horrible, I think there's kind of so much opportunity that we can get from these spaces. And I think by kind of simply just removing and not beginning to understand why the in-between space is the way it is and how it's come to be, we can't learn from the communities that we're designing for. Thank you.
Okay, great. Lovely to see everyone. I echo the previous comments about it being fantastic to do this in person. I'm kind of quite fed up of just staring into the PDF and wondering if there are people behind the PDF that I'm talking to. So I'm Jacob Willson. I'm head of design at BeFirst. And for those that don't know BeFirst, we're a development company wholly owned by Barking and Dagenham Council. And we're a fairly unique development company in the fact that we've got planning under the same roof, design, commercial arm, along with the development and construction team, wholly owned by the council. And we have very ambitious housing targets. So, if you go onto our website and look at what we're doing, it says, we're delivering around 50,000 houses in Barking and Dagenham over the next 20 years. There's a lot of estate regeneration projects. There's a lot of ex-industrial land that we're developing on. So it talks about these kind of numbers. And I think that's led us to think about really, in the context of those numbers, what do we mean by the in-between space? It's not just all about numbers. We really need to be focusing on the public realm. So to introduce what we're doing at BeFirst, I'm going to flick through some of the projects that we're currently working on, and then talk more about the kind of public realm and the in-between spaces that we're also developing. And when I talk about BeFirst ambitions around numbers, I think it's really important to talk about the Becontree estate. The Becontree estate takes up a quarter of the borough. It's 26,000 houses. It was designed in the 1920s to cottage estate principles, and I think it really kind of demonstrates and inspires what can be done by the public sector, what can be done, what can be achieved at speed, and how you can deliver great quality houses with a fantastic public realm, and great parks alongside it. So for us, it's really important to see that this ambition has been done in the past and led by the public sector. So today, this is one of the schemes that we've recently got planning permission for and just moving on site. This is at the Gascoigne estate in Barking, which is where I spend most of my time. We're delivering over 2,000 homes there. It's an estate regeneration project. And I've just put this up to show the kind of larger schemes that we're really focusing on BeFirst is this type of project. So this was designed by White Architecture. We're also focusing on smaller scale projects as well. So this is 200 Becontree. It's designed by Archeo Architects. And this is at the other end of the scale for us. So this is around 30 homes. It's on site currently. It's going to be delivered by the end of this year. And then lastly, in terms of what we're doing in housing, we also have an innovative housing program. So this project is called House for Artists. It's designed by Apparata Architects. And it's part of an innovative house program. So this was cliented by the GLA, by Create, by Barking and Dagenham Council. BeFirst are delivering it. I think what's really interesting about this project is that it's housing for artists. So there's 12 units. They can be occupied by artists. On ground floor, we have artist studios. And the rents for the apartments are 65% market rate. And that's done on the condition that the artists living there give back half a day a week in service, in social outreach, to the community to qualify for those reduced rates. It also includes a degree of communal living as well. So a really interesting project. That's on site in Barking Town Centre currently. And then just quickly in terms of projects we're doing, it's not just residential. We also do a lot of commercial space. So this is a a stacked industrial project that we've been doing with Hayworth Tompkins. And I think it's really interesting. You can see the kind of access to the rear. It's one of the first of its type in the kind of built-up area in the UK where we have this kind of stacked industrial project with the ramp up so you can access those upper floors. So they're the type of large projects that we're delivering at the moment to meet our kind of ambitious housing targets. But recently we've grown a design team in BeFirst, and that's to increasingly think about the in-between spaces. So we have these very ambitious numbers, but what is the public realm like that we're dealing with? How are we working with residents to kind of really think about these type of spaces? And even we're doing a lot of resident consultation. We've done a lot of consultation previously, and the feedback that we keep getting is the importance of the public realm. You know, the kind of the issues that they have currently with the type of alleyways, you know, some of which that Shawn showed in the last presentation, these kind of inward-facing streets, neglected public parks. So we're increasingly thinking about the place-making approach, the public realm between these buildings. So this is a place-making strategy done by White Architecture. This is of the Gascoigne estate in the lower half of the picture, next to Barking Town Centre to the north. And, you know, this came about because we were delivering a lot of parcels of the Gascoigne estate, but we really wanted a place-making strategy that focused on the connections, on how residents would connect to areas that they're going. So we did a lot of engagement and consultation with residents to think about the places that they were going. Historically, it's been a very inward-looking estate. You know, the roads are kind of dominated by cars, and we really wanted to think about how you prioritise pedestrian cycle movement around the estate and improve those connections. But then importantly, we're also really thinking about creating a network of public spaces. I think historically in one half of the Gascoigne estate there was around 30 very small, very poorly overlooked, neglected public spaces, and we're working hard to think about how we can create much better public spaces. So this is one of the parks that we're delivering at Gascoigne. This is an early CGI of the park that's been delivered at Gascoigne Estate in Barking Town Centre. Then we are still interested in this park. One, it's been designed to circular economy principles, so we've used the waste from surrounding estates, from surrounding projects to kind of build this park, but it's also been designed with the community and through a co-design process. So the residents have really come up with the brief. They've worked with our design teams, and it's been a really iterative process to kind of define what these spaces can be. So I think we're aware, you know, like Shawn, you were saying, we're taking away these spaces, these in-between spaces from these people and recreating them. So for us, it's really important that they are working with us to define them. And then the last project that I just wanted to show was this, which is on the Becontree estate. This has been delivered by Barking and Dagenham Council, our sister company and our client. And this is part of the Becontree Centenary, so there's lots of fantastic projects going on in the Becontree Centenary by artists, architects, different programs. This is one by Nimpton Architects, and it kind of takes back to the earlier picture that I showed of the Becontree estate. You can see these corners around the junction. And these have often on the Becontree estate become kind of like a bit tired spaces that people don't use at all. And we're working with Nimpton Architects to think about how we can repurpose those, bring in play spaces, bring in spaces for relaxation, bring in better spaces for people to kind of move through and really celebrate again kind of the key parts of the Becontree estate. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sophie Thompson. I'm from LDA Design. I'm head of public realm at LDA. So I'm a landscape architect, and tonight I was sort of thinking about, well, you know, in terms of the spaces in between, this is what I've lived, breathed, dreamed, delivered my whole working life. This is my career, and actually it's really interesting just kind of reflecting on where we've come from when I first started out and where we kind of are now. And when I sort of first started out, unless we were designing a park or a play area or a city square, it was very much kind of like sort of less enlightened architects and developers. It was the kind of green fuzz around the buildings. We got some absolute shockers. We got given building layouts kind of coming into the game quite late, by the bins, really overshaded, really windy, you know, ramped down into basement car parks, and it's like, you know, we had to be very creative. We had to try and then influence how buildings might be arranged, and, you know, actually now what's fantastic is you know, everyone really values the spaces in between. Actually, the whole philosophy is really, really different, which is fantastic. And no longer do I get to kind of the bit where, you know, the sequence of construction, which then used to get value engineered out, and we had absolute pittance to deliver, you know, stuff. Actually, people realise these are the spaces where people come together. They're where communities build, where if you're not able to access a sort of communal courtyard in your residential block, you can come together with people from different communal, you know, blocks and actually make friends and have a coffee. So they're really important, and it's great. We are, you know, we're in a very, very different place now. So I think, first of all, we need to think about the spaces that got left behind, because there's loads of them all over the place. And this is a scheme which lies between New Oxford Street and High Holborn. It's Museum Street. It's a project we delivered a couple of years ago. So this is pretty typical. You see these all the time. Behind us, we're working on this with Camden Council, and it was a joint venture between Brockton and Oxford Properties. And quite, you know, the redevelopment of the post office building, quite a swanky office development was behind us. This was a space that long term will potentially be built on the back of the NCP car park. And actually, through, you know, what actually is quite a relatively modest intervention has completely transformed the space here. So, you know, we work with sort of local street artists, and this giant sort of super botanic mural. Would have been great if it had been a living green wall, but it was a meanwhile space. We didn't fill it with loads of stuff. There's a coffee cart that comes in, there's community events. It's actually just a place to sit and enjoy nature. And actually, as you walk down the street now, and it's in a really busy part of the city, and this is part of a much bigger West End project that we're currently working on, your blood pressure noticeably drops as you come towards this space. Actually, just even that visual connection with nature, albeit it's kind of pretend nature on the wall, actually is really important. These sort of in-between spaces around the city are everywhere. And the diagram I show here is a project that we worked on a few years ago, again with Camden Council, and it was a public realm vision and strategy for a massive area between King's Cross and Farringdon. And we started looking at the existing open space provision there. Was it working hard enough? And we worked with the community a lot in terms of how they felt about those spaces, you know, and actually started to think about, well, actually, what is the identity and role of these spaces? Can they be improved? But significantly, through actually reassigning space from vehicles closing up streets, inefficient junctions, we were able to create over this area about 1 hectare of new public space in an area that was hugely deficient. And actually, some of these spaces are really tiny, but collectively, the kind of as a sort of living organism of space, they're really important, and how those kind of sequence of spaces work is really important, and these are now sort of subsequently being delivered. Here's an image from a project that's soon to go on site in Newcastle City Centre, and we're really lucky to be delivering about sort of 14 streets and 4 public spaces here as part of the huge city centre transformation, trying to bring people back into the city sort of post-COVID and thinking about the new experiences in terms of cities. And again, this is a very typical kind of space you might see in any town and city across the country, and this is really important. It links Northumberland Street, which is the sort of main retail shopping street, with the university areas, and so we started thinking about, okay, what could this street be, and, you know, sort of thinking about the inside and the outside uses, and, you know, sort of blurring those. So we sort of came up with this idea of a new type of garden street, you know, thinking about bringing play into the street. You know, actually at the moment there's very little play in the city centre. I'm a mother of 2 small boys, and actually, you know, shopping now is really challenging for me, and actually having those moments of incidental play is really important. Bringing in nature, and let's hope we get a real living green wall here that's going to be delivered. But significantly as well is kind of thinking about the dialect of place, and actually not an anywhere, anytime type space. So the statue you see to the top left here is Thomas Bewick, and he sits on a prominent building at the end of that kind of in-between space, and he was the illustrator for the history of British birds and Aesop's fables. So we kind of thought, okay, well, that's really interesting, and he's, you know, and people in Newcastle really care about him. So let's put these kind of hanging bird cages, or, you know, for plants, or, you know, we've got sort of hanging seats, and rather than birds being in the cages, people are in the cages, and let's put these beautiful jewels of birds around the space so people can discover them, and brass rubbings of his original, you know, sketches, you know, within the public realm, and, you know, and not filling it just with stuff for the sake of, you know, filling it, but actually, you know, thinking about how we create these in-between spaces as places actually people want to spend time, and actually different types of use, and thinking about how there might be a catalyst for how the buildings, the kind of inside-outside relationship might change. And finally, a very different project altogether. This is IQL, which is a project that we are working on with Lend-Lease and Alison Brooks. It's just to the south of here is, and the west of here is the Olympic Park. You've got Stratford to the north. And we are delivering a whole sequence of kind of different public spaces, from tiny pocket parks to, you know, bigger squares, you know, in a sort of really, you know, sort of, you know, high density development. And what we're sort of really thinking about here actually is about the idea of supernature, about the idea of bringing the Olympic Park and what we did there into the development, making it as green and as ecological as we can, but also incorporating play. These spaces have to work really hard. They need to be really sort of delightful, and actually also thinking about, well, you know, at 3 o'clock, half the year it's dark, so lighting and actually getting people kind of using the spaces all year round is really important. And actually thinking about the reality of how you deliver that, and a lot of the inspiration was also inspired by kind of fantasy and Alice in Wonderland and doing something really different. So thinking about plants that are kind of edible, that are sensory, that are kind of really interesting foliage, and the detail and the execution of that is going to be really important. So finally, I just thought I'd kind of finish on sort of, you know, 5 kind of sort of takeaways. And I think the first thing, and again quoting from Jan Gehl, first life, then space, then buildings. Let's first of all think about how people are going to use space and the activity, then the space, then actually how the buildings frame that. And I guess as a landscape architect, I'm bound to say that. Number 2, let's think about those forgotten and leftover spaces. And actually they can be tiny, they can just be a perch seat with a tree, but they're really important. So size doesn't matter. Actually, they can be, you know, they can be any size. Let's respond to the dialect of place. Let's try and understand what makes a place special and celebrate that, so we don't just do anywhere, anytime spaces. And finally, I think bringing delight and joy and trying to make people smile, you know, is really important. And public space can be too serious, I think, sometimes. So if we can bring in fun, fantastic. Thank you.
And we've now got about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So I'll kick off with one, but get ready with your questions. So I kind of, as you were all speaking, you know, you all talked about place and kind of belonging and where, and these kind of in-between spaces. But I wondered whether there was a case for saying that the in-between might also be about people. I know Renée mentioned the in-between dweller, and Tina talked about the forgotten middle. And I know a lot of Shawn's work kind of involves kind of young people and who might be forgotten in society. So I wondered kind of, who do you think these kind of in-between people are, and how do we better serve them with our buildings and spaces? Who wants to kick off? Maybe Shawn?
Yeah, I think that was a great question. I think a lot of the time when developments are before they're even built, a lot of the time it's about the kind of residents that will be there, and a lot of the time that isn't necessarily kind of like the younger people or the elderly. It's usually the people that are going to own the building or like are going to live in the actual building. So it's going to be like whether it's the head of the family or like the person that's going to actually purchase the property. However, I think that means as a result that there's a lot of people that don't kind of come under that demographic, that are kind of left, and their voices aren't kind of heard. So a lot of the time they don't feel as if they have spaces that are kind of designed for them, and they tend to end up getting pushed to the periphery, and as a result of that, they are the ones that are kind of dwelling in these in-between spaces. And I think if you look at look back at a lot of the examples, you'll see that in the spaces that you don't necessarily think are that nice. You're seeing the people that might not necessarily be the ones that the actual development is for, in a way. And of course, I mean, you can't really judge from the images, but like seeing it kind of myself in my own area and working with kind of a lot of kind of people in local communities that kind of see developments as quote unquote kind of nefarious, you realize that a lot of people feel as if they're kind of getting pushed out, and I think that's kind of often the sad reality.
Does anyone else want to add anything to that? Nick?
I'll just give you an example. Just talking about Brent Cross. Brent Cross was first conceived as a scheme in 2000. The first spade went into the ground in 2020. And what's happened in the intervening period is that the whole area, every time a fence breaks or there's a pothole, the council have kind of said to themselves, well, there's a big regen coming, so let's spend what money we've got somewhere else. And so what's actually happened is that for 20 years, that area has literally been forgotten. And they have existed in this twilight zone in between their past and their future. And they've always been told that the reason why they're being forgotten is because they've got such a good future. And that is a horrible place to end up in. And sometimes the future genuinely never comes. And that creates a whole area that just gets forgotten, gets left behind, gets underinvested in, and all the people and the businesses that are there get dragged down accordingly.
Well, it's also difficult because the future might not be for you as well.
That's absolutely true, yeah.
Do we have any questions up in the audience? Do you want to put up your hands if you do? There's one over there.
Thanks for your presentations. My question, I think probably I can direct at some of the larger developments, but what are your views on the idea of in-between phases? Because often these are long duration projects that take huge amount of vision to see it through to the end. So maybe it's one for you, Nick, and maybe one for you, Jacob, about how do you navigate between the emergence of a new phase or that time between a phase as it comes forward and onto the next one to make these spaces still meaningful, the in-between the hoarding and in-between the construction site, and as people are moving through the site?
Thanks. Sophie, is that one you can answer as well? I feel that maybe.
Yeah, Callum's actually a colleague of mine, so I'll let my learn and develop colleague friends go first, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, especially on some of the projects that we're working on, like the Gascoigne project, which I showed you. I mean, that was master planned, way before I was at BeFirst and before BeFirst existed. So, that was putting a red line around an estate in 2015 by the council, and then obviously incredibly long-term vision and implementation, probably about 20 years. So I think it's, for me, I think it's, we're increasingly working more on the type of strategies that I showed. We're increasingly aware of the type of meanwhile projects that are important to our residents, again, like the Pocket Park that I showed. And I think we're going to do more and more of those to bring residents on the journey, to really deal with the difficulties of the construction surrounding them and thinking about how we're going to do that, how we're going to improve wayfinding, how we're going to improve the public realm in the temporary nature. And I think temporary projects are really important for that. And on the kind of the scale of the projects that I was showing, that's where we will be prioritising that to help residents deal with it. And I think the other part of it is the co-design element and working with residents to design these spaces. I think, historically, these type of projects were often just, done to communities in the public realm. Wasn't, it was consulted on, but maybe once or twice. And I think that level of engagement, having this kind of very iterative process is really important. And the residents for the park that I showed, helped build it, so they have that kind of long-term ownership of these spaces. So I think it's more tactile projects, it's smaller projects, it's working in more granular detail and kind of listening to the residents a lot more about the type of interim spaces that they want over that type of project.
Tina, do you want to add something about phasing on your own project?
Generally, the scale of projects that we tend to do don't really require phasing, but because usually we'd have something typically from about 35 units to about 150, which would be tackled in one go. But I think when you think about phasing, thinking about meanwhile users is really important. So say, for example, on in Wembley, where you've got Quintain doing different phases at different times, they always bring something like Box Park. It's a great example of a meanwhile use that can really help the community and start, bringing the neighborhood together even before the development is fully grown. And I think things like that make a big difference. Would you like to add something?
I think what I've really noticed has changed a lot, and it is about this kind of people feeling they've got license to actually kind of reclaim the public realm a lot more, actually. And I think COVID has really actually kind of accelerated that. You've obviously seen that with a lot of the kind of low traffic neighbourhoods, and whilst they've been contentious, actually people suddenly have license to, you know, garden on their street, or, you know, set up a picnic table and that sort of thing. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that, for actually how you phase developments. And, you know, and it's challenging when there's not an existing community there, obviously. And I mean, we're working on a project at the moment which is, you know, politically, it's very sensitive. It's in Somers Town. It's called Phoenix Road, and it connects Euston Station with King's Cross and St Pancras. And we're working with kind of gardening charities, and actually thinking about actually lots of different ways of trying to actually activate the public realm, understand different perspectives, people that don't normally get heard. So we're doing play days, we're doing kind of gardening just at the bottom of tree pits. So, you know, it's really, you know, and actually gardening and the whole, and the process of making and coming together for those sort of activities is part of the journey of design, and the conversations that get held during that, I think is, you know, I think there's a lot to be, you know, to sort of said, and I think that, you know, we need to push harder to be doing more of that in the right way.
Thanks. Are there any more questions out there in the audience?
Thanks. It's Gareth from Civic Engineers. I've really enjoyed all the presentations tonight. I thought they were absolutely excellent. One thing I don't think which came up in too many of the presentations, which I just wanted to sort of test the crew on, was one on climate resilience, really. We've talked about all the spaces and places between the buildings and using those spaces. And I suppose some of the designers and developers here, how has things changed within your own ideas on your developments over particularly probably the last couple of years, in terms of how can you design in more climate resilience into your schemes? Obviously there's carbon offsetting, but if you've got a fantastic big scheme with a lot of green space, what sort of endeavours are you putting in place to try and really make them climate resilient and offset some of the carbon, obviously, which we're going to have to use to build the homes, etc.
Right, so I'm going to quickly not make it too long, because if you get me started talking about sustainability and climate, I might never stop. So from a pocket perspective, we have a three-pronged approach where we look at environmental sustainability, which is balancing the embodied carbon along with the operational carbon. And we've worked really hard, especially in our pocket unit, to make that work really well and bring that operational carbon down to the minimum. We're working with architects like Threefold, who, you know, are very innovative, working with structural engineers and a very good team of M&E who can actually help us minimize our embodied carbon. But at the same time, it's also about social sustainability. How are we actually giving back to the community? What are we doing in terms of providing those sort of placemaking principles, and also in terms of providing affordable housing, and balancing all of that with economic sustainability, because at the end of the day, it all comes down to what it's going to cost. So it's a very fine balance to be had, but that is what we're trying to do.
Thanks. Nick, do you want to add something?
Sure. I mean, I think that it's a big question, obviously, and there's lots of different kinds of answers. I mean, put quite simply, at Brent Cross, we are starting actually with embodied carbon rather than operational. For years and years and years, we've all focused on the operational side of things. We've, you know, at King's Cross, we started off with planning permission for, you know, windmills on the roof and things like that, which were then quickly removed from the process once the council realised what they were going to look like. So we're starting actually, we're building timber office buildings, and we are focusing very heavily on that. How do we decarbonise concrete as far as we possibly can? And then we've created a partnership with Vattenfall. So Vattenfall are one of the largest energy services companies in the world. They're owned by the Swedish government. They actually have done some wind farms here, but they are actually going to be the energy services company for Brent Cross. And on top of that, we then overlay the sort of functional, a functional attitude of circular economy and waste. And we are then looking at how do we actually create meaningful offsetting. And we're going through a process on King's Cross at the moment, actually, where we're looking at how we can do that rather than just kind of paying some money for some far-flung project somewhere. How do we actually get purposely involved in something that actually creates the offset? So we know we're looking to be net zero, and we know that the only way we can do that is for there to be some offsetting in the process. But we want that to be a meaningful form of offset, and we don't actually have a good answer to that yet. I don't think we have a good answer to that yet. So we're trying hard. I don't actually think we're doing enough yet, is the honest truth, and I don't think our industry is doing enough yet. It is 10 times more than we were doing 10 years ago, but we're still not anywhere near doing enough. I haven't figured out the answer, so I'm not going to pretend I have.
Thanks. We've got one question down at the front here.
Thank you, Gareth. Just to follow on what Gareth was saying, I'm a Charlotte Glazier from Lambeth Council. I'm a regeneration officer and also a landscape architect. So one of the kind of landscape architecture things that we get drilled into our head is putting the landscape first. So I'll challenge you, would you consider actually putting the landscape first to then design the building? So, well, just anybody, in terms of putting the landscape first, so rather than creating like rather than going, oh, it's the in-between space, actually saying, prioritizing the actual space, seeing how it needs to work, how it needs to function, and then seeing how the building best fits. Do you think after everything that we've witnessed and all the kind of challenges we face, that would you now consider that way of thinking? Are you going to think like a landscape architect?
Is that aimed at Nick or is it aimed at other people?
Anybody wants to.
I'll just say very quickly, that's how we approach King's Cross. Quite simply, we started by saying to ourselves, how do we create a place where people will want to be, where businesses will want to locate themselves? And that wasn't altruistic, it's because it makes every single square foot that we build more valuable. It's as simple as that. If you start from the other way round, you might build more space, but it will be less valuable. And you won't create the desire for people to want to be there and spend time. We do surveys quite regularly at King's Cross, and the best answer we get for why are you here is, it's just a good vibe, I like hanging out here. If you can achieve that, then you will create value in the stuff that you do. And we are a commercial developer, we have to create value in what we do. And so it's good business, as well as a good social space.
Thanks. Renée, I see you clutching the mic. Go for it.
I think it's a combination of landscape, but also it's very much about place and people. And a kind of, any good master planner starts with that from the outset, to understand the history, the context, the geography, and they all layer together to inform those decisions. So I think it's a sort of layered approach rather than a landscape only.
Thanks. So I think now's a good point to kind of wrap up and start to talk about all of this over a drink in the bar. For me, what I found really interesting is that we've talked about so many different spaces, and there's clearly a real power to the in-between space. We've talked about exhibitions, huge developments, green spaces, kind of in-between spaces, murals, everything. And I think the kind of in-between is almost these forgotten sites, but it's not just about a forgotten site. People plan the in-between as a huge part of their developments. So I guess I always think of there's one quote by Mozart where he says, music is not the notes, but it's the spaces in between the notes that makes the music. And I think that's kind of what it is in architecture as well. It's the spaces in between the buildings that make the architecture. So I'd just like to say thanks to all the speakers here tonight, and to Threefold, and to everyone for coming. And go have a drink. Thanks.